Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's video, we are going to go through how to create a JavaScript counter from scratch. And this is how the counter looks like. You can decrement, so this button is for decrementing. You can increment, so incrementing is adding 1. And you can reset back to 0. So this is the functionality we are going to go through. And already the HTML is already built. So I have already built the HTML in the initial branch. So the master branch holds the final code, but the initial branch holds the initial code. So if you check JavaScript, you don't have any code of JavaScript, but in the HTML, we do have the HTML, which is the source files for this counter. And then the other one is the license. So you also have the article we can go through here. So in this article, this is a beginner friendly project to help you understand JavaScript DOM manipulation. And we are basically going to go through it using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then here is a prerequisite. So clone the repository. I have linked the link to the repository here. So you can clone the whole repository and then check out to the initial branch, which I'm going to do, or else you could just clone the single branch, which is the initial branch only. So the next thing you're going to do is that we need a text editor. I'm going to use VS Code. We also have a link there. And I'm also going to use an extension called Live Server, which is going to serve our application to the browser. All right. And then the next thing we need is to run the project. So this is the extension, how it looks like. So on the bottom of your Visual Studio Code, you can just click Go Live. And then after Go Live, this is the starter page. And then we are going to start from there. So let me open my terminal. So in my case, I'm just going to clone the whole repository. And then I'll check out to the initial branch. So you come here and I'll copy the SSH link. Then I paste it here. Then I can add git clone that repository. All right. So it has already cloned. Then you can open JavaScript counter in VS Code. So you just do code and then the folder that you want to open in VS Code. So this is our project. And as I said, this is a basic HTML page. So we already have the HTML page built because our focus is on JavaScript, but it is a very simple. We have the CSS styles here. We have the CSS styles. And then now this is a very basic HTML code. So we do have the actual counter. This is the counter that we will increment, decrement, or reset. Then we have a heading. So we have the decrement button, we have the reset button, and we have an increment button. And all these buttons have been given an ID. So an ID is a unique identifier for each element. You could use a class, you could use a tag, but for this tutorial, we're going to use the ID. So ID is a unique identifier for this specific element. And then this element is called a button. So something else we'll learn is that each element, whatever an element holds, so like this span element, which is our counter for this case, is going to hold a value or other elements. And then we are going to see how can we get that element, how can we increment it, how can we decrement it. So the next thing I want to show you is that we have this extension called Go Live, called the Live Server. You can come and search it here in the marketplace. So go to the extension tab, search Live Server, this one, and then install it. And then after installing it, you'll see it right here in the bottom. So make sure your file is opened. So make sure you're not in the JavaScript. So I also need to check out to, I almost forgot. It's switch initio. All right, so initial branch doesn't have anything in the script. So make sure you are in the HTML template, the HTML file that you want to go live with. So you want to go live with the index.html. Then you can see the go live here on the bottom, and that whatever you want to do here is just to click it. So if you click it, it will open a new page, and then you can see we don't have functionality yet in the JavaScript counter. So we do have the heading, we have the counter itself, decrement, reset, and increment button. So let's get started. So the first thing we are going to do is that already, so we have the styles. This is a very basic counter. Already we have linked our JavaScript file to the HTML template. So don't wonder why the JavaScript is working. You need to link it. So the JavaScript is already linked. So we can start working with I can open them side by side. And then here I open the script. So the very first thing we want to do is that we need a reference to those elements that we are working with. So currently in our counter, we are working only with the counter itself, the decrement, the reset, and the increment. So these are the elements that we are going to work with. So these are the elements we need a reference to. And then to get a reference of a specific element, you have very many methods. But the one we are going to use now is called, the one we are going to use here is called the get element by ID. So get element by ID. So the way this is pronounced is get the element by this given ID. So we already gave our elements, each element its own ID. So we have this ID is decrement, this ID is reset, and then this ID is increment. So we can get these specific elements by their own ID using this method called get element by ID. So this is exactly what we are going to do. So the first thing we need is the counter. What is the counter? Our counter is this. You can call it counter, or whatever you want. But in my case, I called it counter. So you can say const, we are creating a variable in JavaScript. So this is nothing new. We are just creating a variable. So we call it, you can give it any name. You can call it counter, count, whatever you want, but give it a unique name that is identifiable. So, and then we can say, we call the document. So in my previous articles, I talked about the document. The document is the whole document, this HTML document. And this document has methods that helps us from the JavaScript perspective to interact with the DOM. So the DOM is the whole document. So we have a method that is defined in the document that is called get element by ID. And then here, to get that specific element, you pass its own ID. So the ID of our count is the count. And then you pass the ID as a string, because in JavaScript, you have to work with the valid data type. So here you cannot say count. You can say count because count is not one of the data types in JavaScript. So here we need to pass a string, which is the count. And then this will go ahead and give us a reference to this element, to the span element. And then we can start working with it. So we can get the other elements. So the next element we can grab is the decrement. So we can start const decrement button. So I'm just trying to make it descriptive. You can say document.get element by ID. So you also have other methods to get elements from the DOM. We have get element by class name. We have query selectors. We have get element by tag. But in our scenario, we're just going to use the get element by ID. So the ID of the decrement button is decrement. And you can say const increment button is equals to document dot get element by ID, and then we have increment. So this, we are just grabbing this element. And finally, this is the last item we are going to work with. So there is reset button. So we can say document dot get element by ID reset. So we have a reference to the items we need to work with. So whenever you have a reference to an item you want to work with, you can do very many things with it. You can change their styles. You can change their content. You can add event listeners. You can do a lot of things. You can animate them from JavaScript. But in our scenario, the first thing we need to do, let's first work with the decrement button. So if you go back to the article, if you follow this article step by step, this article is beginner friendly. You can go through it and understand how it is working. But for my scenario, I'm not going to go through it. This is for your own reference. So we want to decrement the counter. So this one is the live. Let's work with this. So this is the one we are working with. It doesn't have functionality. So we are working with this counter decrement button. So this decrement button, the first thing we need to capture is the click event. So I'm clicking. We can also capture different other methods. We can capture double click. All right. We can capture drags. All right. We can capture key down. We can capture all sorts of things. So we can capture a specific event. So in our scenario, we want whenever someone clicks once, that's a click. We want to decrement the value of the counter. So if I go back, we already have a reference to the button. So the next thing we need to do is to add an event listener. To add an event listener, you call the element. So you technically could skip this initialization of a variable and then do, let me show you, decrement.get element by id decrement, and then you start chaining. You can say dot add event listener. So you have another method that this method is applicable to elements. So by doing this, we have access to the element. And then as soon as you have the access to the element, you can start adding an event listener. But in our scenario, we already saved this element in a variable so that we don't have to repeat ourselves and to make the code cleaner. So we can call the decrement button, which will give us this button. Then we add an event listener to the button. And this event listener has its own syntax. So what the first argument, so this is a function, and the first argument it receives, it's the type of event. So the type of event, you can see we have so many events. We have blur, click, cross, copy, double click, drag, ended, focus. We have so many events, but in our case, we just want to capture the click event. So the first argument is the click event. The next argument is the handler who is handling this click. So we have captured someone clicked. So who is going to handle this? So essentially here we pass in a function. So we can come here and create a function called decrement. So let me show you. So this element, you hover over here. Let me just show you. You can see it receives the current element that has been clicked, but this is optional. We don't need to worry about this. Even if you read about this, the event listener methods of the event target interface sets up a function that will be called whenever the specified event is triggered. And then, so the listener of so in our scenario, we have captured this event, which is a click. Who is going to handle that event? So in our scenario, we need to pass a reference. We're not going to call it. So here is something else. You are not going to call the function. We are going to pass a reference, and then JavaScript will call this function as soon as this click event is captured. All right. So this method, whenever JavaScript captures this event, which is a click, it calls in a function. So we don't call the function ourselves, JavaScript calls it. So what do we pass to the JavaScript? To JavaScript, we pass it a reference to the function so that it will call it later on. All right. So inside here, I could use the global alert and say, hey, I have been clicked. All right. And then if I go back to the browser, you can see, so we clicked, JavaScript captured that event of clicking, and then it ran the function, and the function it ran is the decrement function, and then this function has an alert. Something else you might have seen in other tutorials or other or books or references is that you can pass the function inside here instead of creating it outside. All right, but whenever you are starting, make sure to, you can see this function is not called, this function is just created. This is an anonymous function that is just created and JavaScript will call it. So this is the same way. We can still say alert hey. Then if you go back, we can get an alert of hey. So you could pass in the function here inline, or you can create a function outside and then pass a reference to it. The same thing, but if you are a beginner, this is the best syntax to use. So let's continue with our tutorial. So the first thing is we have captured that someone has clicked the decrement. What else do we need to do? So the first thing we need to do is that we have our counter. So the counter is this. We need to grab this value that it has inside here. So how do we get that? We use another method. So we can say const counter value. We are getting the value. We can call the counter. We already have access to the counter here. We got the counter from the DOM. We have access to it. So we can call the counter and then use the property called innerText to give us the inner text of the counter. And this always gives us a string. So let me show you. So you can say alert and then we alert the counter value. So if we go back, we get the counter value is 0. So this is another property. So this is a property that gives us, we can use, we also have, we have the reset. The reset has the value of reset. So even if, so you can say reset value is equals to reset button dot inner text, and then we can console log reset button, reset value. So we can also get the value of the reset element, which is the reset. So let's see. We grab the reset. So it's basically very simple. So we don't need this. This was just for illustration. So we do have the counter value. What do we do with the counter value? As soon as we have the counter value, we are decrementing it. So what we do is that const new counter value, I'm just creating a variable, is equals to counter value minus 1. But this one will fail. So let me just show you. This one will fail. Why? Because the text from the DOM is a string and we are trying to, so let me console log this. Let me alert this new counter value. And then we can see. So it is working well with the mods, but just to be safe, make sure to always wrap anything from the DOM using the number to convert it to a number. Make sure you don't have errors down the line. So you are trying to convert this to a number. In case it comes as a string, then we can do the mods with it, because let's try doing the plus. JavaScript will behave differently. So let's do the plus and see. This is something called type coercion in JavaScript. You have to be very keen on it. So we get 0, 1. All right. Let me show you something very tricky. So what if the counter started at 0, 1, not at 0? So this is a string. So the text from the HTML is always a string. So counter value is a string of character 1. So counter value here is 1. Something like that. So what will happen? Whenever JavaScript encounters an addition of a string and a number, it does something called type coercion, whereby it converts the number into a string. So let me show you. So counter value is 1. And then we add 1 to 1. JavaScript does something called type coercion, and it converts the second value into a string. And then it converts this into a string. So this becomes 1 string plus 1 string, which now goes to string concatenation, and then we get 11. Because string concatenation says we just append strings together. So we just append this and this. So let me just show you practically. So if we go back and then we did the decrement, then we can get 11. So this is why I'm telling you that you need to convert values from the DOM to a number. You can do pass int, but you can simply use the number. And then since this is a decrement, we can do -1. So we already got the new value. What do we do to the new value? We set it back to the original counter. So how do we do that? So we call the counter, and then we say we set the property directory. So we set the innerText is equals to the new counter value. And then that's it. That's it for the decrement. So let's start at 0. Let's start at 0. Then we go back. Then our decrement is working as expected. So next up, let's work on the reset. Let's work on the increment because the reset is quite simple. So we come here and duplicate this line, and then we can say increment button. We capture the click, and then we create a new function called increment. So we can just copy paste this, and then we could do something quite sneaky here. We could create one function that decrements and increments. But since I'm assuming you're a beginner, that would be your task for the day. So task for the day, create a reusable function to increment and decrement. Decrement, and reset. So that's your task for the day. The person who is going through the article, their task is to create the increment function and the reset. So you want to increment, and then we just change this to +1, and then we call it, and then everything works. So the first thing we need to do is that we get the current value. So the current value, we said we get it using this innerText property of the current item, of the element you want to grab. Then after getting that value, you perform some calculations to it. So we convert it into a number and add 1 to it because we're incrementing it. And then we go back to the DOM and set the innerText of that element to the new value. And then this one works. The decrement works. The reset doesn't work. So that's what we are going to work in next. So we continue to add another event listener. So this one will be for the reset button. We add an event listener. We want to listen for a click. Then we call a reset function that we are going to create. And as I said, you could create these functions inline here. All right. Let me show you. Let me just, for the sake of this, this is just an anonymous function that is added inline, but this function is not yet called, it's just declared. So there's no difference with that with this. So we could use the reset. Let's work on the reset using this function, and then we follow the same procedure. But now on the reset, we don't care about the current value. We don't really care about the current value of the counter. So what do? We just want to set it to 0. So we call the counter, and then we set its own innerText property into 0. We don't care. We don't really care about its current value. We just set it to 0. Then if you go back, you decrement, and then you reset. Increment, and then you reset. And that's it, guys. That's how you add increment, decrement. That's how you create a JavaScript counter. And then we could do more. Let me know in the comments, whereby if you are using a PC and you press the up arrow, we increment. You press the down arrow, we decrement. And then we can say, yeah, that's it, guys. Make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can go through the article. It has everything you need to learn, and it has also have an exercise for you to work on. Thank you, and have a happy coding.